In 2024, a video game company triggered one of the most heated historical arguments Japan had seen in years. Not over politics, not over religion, over a man who lived in Japan for approximately 2 years in the 16th century, and left behind fewer than a dozen confirmed historical references. That man is Yasuke, and if you've heard of him, there's a good chance much of what you've heard is wrong. Welcome back to the Bushi Files. This is File 2. Chapter 1. What the record actually says. Let me start with something most discussions about Yasuke skip, a precise account of what the historical sources actually contain. There are 4 primary sources that mention Yasuke by name or clear description. First, the letters of Luis Frois, a Portuguese Jesuit missionary stationed in Japan during this period. Frois wrote 2 accounts that mention Yasuke, a letter from 1581 and the 1582 annual report of the Jesuit mission in Japan. These are eyewitness-adjacent documents written by someone in Japan at the time. Second, the Shinchokoki, the Chronicle of Lord Nobunaga, written by Ota Gyuichi, one of Nobunaga's own retainers. This is the closest thing we have to an official chronicle of Nobunaga's career. Third, the Diary of Matsudaira Ietada, a samurai retainer who recorded events of the period. That's essentially it. Everything else, and there is a great deal of everything else, is inference, speculation, or later invention. What do these sources confirm? Yasuke was an African man. He arrived in Japan in 1579 in the service of Alessandro Valignano, an Italian Jesuit who served as visitor of the Society of Jesus in Asia. He was described as approximately 26 or 27 years old in 1581. He was tall. The sources note this consistently. He served Oda Nobunaga. He was present at the Honnoji incident in 1582. After Honnoji, he was captured by Akechi Mitsuhide's forces and handed over to the Jesuits rather than executed. After that, nothing. No further historical record exists. Chapter 2. The Arrival. To understand how Yasuke ended up in Nobunaga's court, you need to understand the Jesuit presence in Japan. By the 1570s, the Society of Jesus had been operating in Japan for over 2 decades. Alessandro Valignano arrived in Japan in 1579 to inspect and reorganize those operations. He brought a large retinue, and among them was the man who would become known as Yasuke. We don't know his original name. Yasuke is almost certainly a Japanese phonetic approximation, but of which name, from which language, we don't know. His African origin is confirmed. Which part of Africa is not? Frois describes his physical appearance in detail. Some scholars suggest he may have been Dinka, from what is now South Sudan, based on the physical descriptions recorded. Others point to Mozambique, a Portuguese colonial hub with active Jesuit connections, as more logistically likely. Neither has been established conclusively. What the record does tell us: when Valignano's party arrived in Kyoto in 1581, Nobunaga heard about this man and wanted to meet him. The Shinchokoki records that Nobunaga initially believed Yasuke's dark skin was dye or pigment and had him scrubbed. When the color didn't change, Nobunaga's reaction shifted to genuine fascination. He invited Yasuke to his court. Chapter 3. What Nobunaga gave him. What happened next is the central question, and the source of the debate that has consumed historians and the internet alike. The Shinchokoki records that Nobunaga gave Yasuke a stipend, a house, and a sword. He kept him close. Yasuke accompanied Nobunaga throughout his final period. The stipend and the sword are what matter here, because in the context of 16th century Japan, these were things given to retainers in service. Now, here is where we need to be careful. The word samurai is not a simple label. In the Sengoku period, the warrior class encompassed many different levels, roles, and statuses. A samurai could mean a highly ranked general with significant land and power, or it could describe someone in armed service at a much lower level. The categories were not cleanly defined in the way that later, more formal accounts suggest. Japanese historian Yu Hirayama, who has studied this question directly, has stated there is no doubt that Yasuke served as a samurai retainer to Nobunaga, pointing to the stipend, house, and sword as evidence fully consistent with that status. Other scholars disagree. They argue that the gifts could indicate a valued attendant rather than a formal warrior, that the sword may have been ornamental, that without clearer documentation of a combat command role or land allocation, samurai is an inference, not a documented fact. Both positions are held by credible historians. This is a genuine, unresolved scholarly debate. Chapter 4. The Manuscript Problem. Here is where the story gets considerably more complicated, and where a great deal of the misinformation originates. The Shinchokoki exists in multiple manuscript versions. The most widely available version in the West is the Sonkei Bon, an Edo period reconstruction. Here is the problem. The Edo period came after the Sengoku era by several decades, and Edo period writers had their own political reasons to shape how the Sengoku era was remembered. A 2025 academic study examining manuscript discrepancies in the Shinchokoki found that several specific details in the Sonkei Bon version, including details that Western scholars have relied on to assess Yasuke's role, do not appear in earlier manuscript versions. What this means for the Yasuke debate is still being worked through by researchers, but it raises legitimate questions. Which version of the record are we reading, and when was it written? This is the level at which serious historians are currently working. It is not a simple question of, was he a samurai or not? It is a question about which manuscripts can be trusted. And that question does not have a settled answer yet. Chapter 5. Honnoji and After. What happened to Yasuke at Honnoji is one of the few things the sources address, though briefly. Frois writes that Yasuke was present during the attack. He fought. Nobunaga was killed. The temple burned. When Akechi Mitsuhide's forces captured Yasuke, Mitsuhide reportedly said that Yasuke was not Japanese and therefore not worth executing as a defeated enemy, and ordered him handed over to the Jesuit house in Kyoto. That is the last confirmed historical reference to Yasuke. What happened after? Unknown. Did he remain in Japan? Did he leave with Valignano, who departed Japan in 1582? Did he eventually return to Africa? No document answers this. The man who had been given a house and a stipend by the most powerful figure in Japan disappears from the record entirely in 1582. That absence is its own kind of historical fact. Chapter 6. How the story got distorted and why it matters. The accurate version of Yasuke's story, a documented but fragmentary account of an African man who occupied a genuine, unusual position in Nobunaga's court, is compelling enough on its own. So why did it get so distorted? Part of the answer involves a 2016 book called African Samurai, co-authored by Thomas Lockley. The book reached a wide audience and gave Yasuke's story enormous popular momentum. The problem, multiple historians have documented that the book significantly overstates what the primary sources actually say. Sections of the book that read as factual narrative are, in some contexts, acknowledged by Lockley to be informed speculation. The book does not make this clear. Here's where it gets structurally problematic. Articles citing Lockley were cited by other articles, which were cited by others still. The speculation entered the standard English language record through what researchers call circular referencing. Source A is cited by Source B, which is cited by Source C. But the origin of every claim is Source A, and Source A is doing creative work. By the time Assassin's Creed Shadows used Yasuke as a central character in 2024, depicting him as a legendary warrior, the fictional elaborations had been cited so many times that many people, including journalists covering the controversy, could not tell where the documented history ended and the invention began. The controversy that followed was real, loud, and often conducted by people on both sides who hadn't read a single primary source. That's not a moral failing. The Frois letters are in 16th century Portuguese. The Shinchokoki is in classical Japanese. Most people depend on secondary accounts, but it means that the public debate about Yasuke was largely a debate about Lockley's version of events, not about what the Jesuit letters and the chronicle actually say. Here is what the record gives us. A man named Yasuke, African, tall, probably in his mid-20s, arrived in Japan in 1579 and ended up in the court of the most consequential warlord of the era. Nobunaga was fascinated by him. He was given things consistent with retainer status. He was present at one of the most dramatic moments in Japanese history. And then he disappeared. Whether that makes him a samurai depends on definitions that were already contested in the 16th century, and on manuscript questions that scholars are still working through. What it makes him, unambiguously, is someone whose actual story is worth telling accurately. That's File 2. The sources I found most useful, the Frois accounts, analyzed in Michael Cooper's They Came to Japan, the Shinchokoki, as translated by J.S.A. Elisonas and J.P. Lamers, and for the manuscript question, a 2025 textual study of the Shinchokoki and Yasuke, available on ResearchGate. File 3 covers the man who avenged Nobunaga in less than 2 weeks, and then spent 30 years building something Nobunaga never could. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant who became ruler of Japan. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if I've got something wrong, the comments are open. This is one file at a time.